lap yourself into stitches, and welcome to my home studio. I'm actually filming this in my dining room. I found that the shop, Aloha Sewing Back in Hillsboro, Oregon, where I do my classes, was a little bit on the noisy end when I was filming. So I got a few little complaints on the noise in the background and thought, yeah, it was distracting for me too. And as much as I would love them to shut their shop down so I could do this little video, I didn't think it was appropriate. So I thought I'd bring it home and film it in my house, and it's nice and quiet. So anyway, welcome to my home. And today I am sharing some tips and techniques from class 2 of the Farmer's Wife Sampler Quilt. We're using this 1920s Farmer's Wife Sampler Quilt book created by Laurie Aaron Hird. And I am sharing how to piece this quilt using modern methods. Laurie's method was hand piecing with templates. Mine is using modern rotary cutting and piecing techniques. Class 2, I'll be sharing how to make half square triangles and how to trim them up. We will also be learning the Magic 8 technique and how to cut 1/16 of an inch cuts, which sounds kind of scary and it is a little bit daunting, but it can be done. But before I get going on any of that, I wanted to say a big thank you to Bev Bryan from Blossom and Bev. You can follow her on Instagram. She's the creator of this small sampler using some of the blocks from my classes. And she has such a bright and cheery way of putting her fabrics together. I just couldn't help but share this and show it to everybody. I have the tendency to make my quilts more on the primitive end of things, and my first one was very similar to the one shown on the back of the book using the brown fabrics. It was very scrappy, and I will get a picture of that for you to see. It is on my bed and has been on my bed for since 2013, I think. So a long time, and I just love it, just love it. But anyway, a big thanks to Bev for doing this little sample for me, and it's just awesome. Many of you probably already know how to make half square triangles and possibly have used the Magic 8 method before, but I am going to go ahead and demonstrate both those techniques so that for those who don't know how to do it, they can learn here as they progress with this class. And specifically, I want to talk about how to square those half square triangles up so that you don't cut off points and they come out nice and square. So let me demonstrate that for you. The first thing I want to demonstrate is how to make half square triangles. And in block 34 here, there is larger half square triangles and a number of smaller half square triangles. So here's how you make half square triangles. You take 2 fabric squares of equal size, and I draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of one of those squares. Then I sandwich them right sides together, and I'll take them over to my ironing board and I press them together and maybe even introduce a little bit of spray starch to help stabilize those 2 squares together. Then I'll take them over to my sewing machine and I stitch 1/4 inch on either side of this drawn line, which I think maybe there you go, you can see it there. Once those are stitched together, we're gonna cut them apart. The diagonal is right through the center of this square. Once that is cut open, I'll have 2 triangle units that look like this. I will take them over to my ironing board and I will gently press them, usually to the dark side. Press it over to the dark. And before I press them open, I will heat set the seam, which means I will put a little heat just lightly on top of this seam, and then I will flip the fabric over and press open or press the seam to one side. So that is how that looks when it's done. The important thing is how do you trim this block? How do you trim this block so that it comes up nice and square? There are 2 ways that I can do this. I have a block lock, and it has a little groove inside here which nestles right up against that seam. Okay, now I'm going to trim this block, and once my seam is nestled into that little groove, you'll notice that my 3.5 inch mark is right here and also right here. And I have a little bit of fabric hanging over the edge of that, as well as over the edge of the outside of my ruler. I'm going to trim those 2 edges first. Good. So I trim the 2 outer edges first, and then I'm going to flip my block around. And I also want to mention that I always start with my little bunny tail or my dog ear, whichever you want to refer it to, up in the right hand corner. I will go ahead and place my block lock with that little groove right inside that seam line, and you can see it just nestles right in there. Now my 3.5 inch line is right on the fabric. And I go ahead and trim the other two sides. And I end up, with a nice squared, half square triangle. And what you want to avoid is cutting off these two little ends. Sometimes if you don't line up your block correctly, you will end up with some of this chopped off. So maintaining that diagonal line on the ruler is really important. And if you don't have a block lock, you can use your basic Omnigrid ruler or any ruler that has a 45-degree angle. And I will place that 45-degree angle right along that seam line, and using the same sort of method that I just showed, I will line this up. It's really important that you maintain that diagonal line on the seam line. Okay, the second method I'm going to demonstrate is the Magic 8 method, and I actually have a more in-depth tutorial on my YouTube channel called the Magic 8. So I would refer you to that to really watch a more comprehensive way of creating this Magic 8. But for the purpose of class 2, I'm just going to go briefly through it. We have a number of half square triangles in a lot of the blocks in the Farmer's Wife quilt. And you'll see that we have 8 of the same size in this particular block. The Magic 8 is similar to the half square triangle, only we're using larger squares to create 8 half square triangles at one time. And we use 2 fabric squares of like size, right sides together, and this time we draw a diagonal line corner to corner, here and here. We draw that diagonal line again on the opposite corners. At that point, I will heat set my fabric squares together and take them over to my sewing machine. This time I will stitch a 1/4 inch on each side of that drawn line. I will stitch this one first, I'll flip it over, stitch this second, and then I will stitch this one and then stitch my 4th one. Once those are all stitched together, you can see, let me see if I can get that. That's how it looks there. But it's kind of rumpled. And so I don't like the rumpled look. I want it nice and flat. So I will take it over to my ironing board and press that before I cut these into the 8 half square triangles. But I also left this thread. I wanted to show you that. I'm a real stickler for trimming your loose threads off when you get done sewing. So many quilters don't trim those off. I don't know, it's one of those things that I like things nice and clean and tidy, and it helps me, it just helps me mentally, I guess. But anyway, if you have these, just get in the habit of trimming off these loose threads. So here it is, all nicely pressed. So you're going to cut it in 4 cuts, and the first one is going to be vertical. You're going to take whatever size square this is, and you're going to divide that in half to find the center. And obviously the center is right there with your intersection. But I placed my ruler right on, this happens to be a 5-inch square. My 2.5 inch line should be right on top of my fabric, and my ruler will be going right through my intersection. So go ahead and trim that. Without shifting this unit, go ahead and switch your ruler around and cut it apart horizontally. Your last 2 cuts will then simply be on the drawn lines, one diagonal and the other diagonal. And again, for a more comprehensive look at the Magic 8 method, I would refer you to my Magic 8 method YouTube video, where you'll find on my YouTube channel. So that is the Magic 8, and you end up with 8 of these tiny half square triangles just using these 2 fabric squares. How cool is that? You also want to trim these up same way as you do with a half square triangle, making sure that your seam is lined up with your 45-degree line on your ruler before you trim them to whatever size. In my Magic 8 YouTube video, I do have a chart which will tell you what size fabric squares to start with in order to get the size half square triangles that you desire. So this concludes the half square triangles and the Magic 8 method. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be learning how to identify and cut 1/16 of an inch increments. and this is the block that we'll be using those measurements in. It's not that difficult, it's just a matter of training your eye to identify those tiny little spaces between the 1/8 of an inch marks on your ruler. Once those increments are cut and you're ready to put your block together, it's no different than putting any other block together. So let me show you how to identify those 1/16ths of an inch on your ruler. I'm just going to show you a couple different examples of 1/16ths of an inch on your ruler. And this particular example is 1 7/16 of an inch. So how do I know that? Each one of these marks is 1/8 of an inch right there. Everything between one of those little marks is a 1/16. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And 7 is right between the 1/2 inch mark and the 3/8 of an inch mark. 8/16 is actually 1/2. So if you have something larger than 8/16, you know you're going to be on the other side of that 1/2 inch mark. For example, let's do right there. Just about right there. So there's my 8/16 mark, which is my half inch. 8, 9, 10, and then 11. So this is 1 11/16. So what I recommend people that are taking my class is that you really get comfortable with your ruler. Identify those halfway points between your 1/8 of an inch marks and start looking at those carefully. In class 2, you will have one block, only one this time, that deals with 1/16 of an inch. Okay, the one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is we are going to be using loose triangles. And loose triangles are created by simply cutting a square on the diagonal and you get 2 triangles. The one thing about the triangles is they have a bias edge that you have to be very careful with. I'm going to share a couple tips on how to work with loose triangles when you're building a block. So let me demonstrate what we're going to be using in class 2 using these tiny little loose triangles. Here is an example of how we will be using some of the half square triangles in a few of the Farmer's Wife blocks. This one is stitching 2 half square triangles together and ending with a loose triangle being something that looks like this, just a square cut in half to create this triangle. But what I wanted to mention is these loose triangles have a bias, so you have to be careful because it is stretchy on this side. So when you are sewing this to your half square triangles, you want to make sure that you do not stretch it while you're stitching. And I don't recommend pinning this triangle to your half square triangle to keep it in place, because when you take that pin out, it can distort. So I tend to either line it up right on my sewing machine and just stitch very carefully. I do 1 stitch at a time. I try to really pay attention to my 1/4 inch because that is important, and I find that I do a pretty good job with that. But if you need a little assistance, there is a product called Seam-A-Line, and here it is here. And it is a lightweight sort of a glue. I would take and put a little dab of glue right on the intersection here and line up my loose triangle, and I'm lining up my right angle so they're right together. And once I line up my half square triangle with my loose triangle, I will take it over to my ironing board and heat set that. And that adheres that seam line to your fabric and keeps those 2 pieces in place. Then let it cool for a second, doesn't take a long time, and take it over to your sewing machine and stitch out right down, maintaining your quarter of an inch. And so once that is stitched in place, you'll just flip it over and press. So you want to pay attention to those loose triangles when they're stitched onto other units for your blocks. So this concludes Class 2 tips and thoughts on creating the blocks for the Farmer's Wife Sampler Quilt. There are 10 blocks in this lesson, and each one of them deals with half square triangles or magic 8 method, loose triangles, 16ths of a cut. We also revisit corner triangles from Class 1. I hope you find this video helpful and a little quieter while you continue farming and building your blocks. I'll see you next month with Class 3 tips and thoughts, and in the meantime, happy farming! Here are the blocks from Class 2 that we've created this month. And I am using a Minnick & Simpson fabric line called Lexington. Most of it, not all of it, but isn't it pretty? I just love it. Love, 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 love it.